Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second day of our conference, Abundance Without Attachment. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us, and thank you especially to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, from whom we will learn once again how we can mix compassion with our economic system, how we can lift up people around the world with the tools of an international economy that is fair and that is just and is based on principles of love and brotherhood. We have two exciting sessions this morning that will lead us up into our lunch. We're starting with our moderator, Sadanand Dume, who is AEI's scholar in India studies and who is helping us to build our practice here in this great country. We're going to start with the power of free enterprise, addressing these exact issues of how free enterprise can truly lift other people up. And we'll follow with a session on morals and markets that will be moderated by Robert Dorr from AEI. So without any further hesitation, I turn it over to my colleague, Sadanand Dume.
Thank you very much, Arthur, and thank you, Your Holiness. Looking forward to a great discussion. I have three tremendous panelists, and I won't take a lot of time introducing them because you already have their bios in your packet. But we have Hernando de Soto, who is one of the world's best-known economists and truly a pioneering thinker on how to think about capitalism, free enterprise, especially in the developing world. His resume probably would take up all the space I have in this folder, so I won't go into details. To my right, we have an old friend of mine, Shiv Khemka, someone I deeply admire, who has mixed two very interesting worlds that sometimes are seen as disparate. He is both an extremely successful businessman, both in India and in Russia and beyond, and he's also a philanthropist and someone who cares very deeply about education in particular. Next to Mr. De Soto, we have Vishnu Swaminathan, who is the country head of Ashoka Innovators. Vishnu thinks very deeply about the poor, how to help the poor, particularly in ways that go beyond traditional means. So we're looking forward to a very interesting conversation among the three of them, and of course, with the rest of our guests, and also with your insights, Your Holiness. Let me start with you, Hernando. One of the interesting insights that you have raised is the idea that in many developing countries, the problem really isn't too much capitalism, but too little, or too little access to the formal rules that make free enterprise possible. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Well, I guess another way of formulating your question, which is right on, is not only asking why so little have so much, but why so many have so little. And it's a crucial question because it's already been now about 150 years, depending on how you look at it, or maybe since the fall of the Berlin Wall, that undoubtedly capitalism has won the economic game. It's destroyed its rivals, and there is really no alternative for the moment. And so if there isn't, the question is, why is still a great part of humanity unhappy with it? And obviously it means that it doesn't just come by itself. Certain things have happened, for example, in Anglo-Saxon countries, dominated by common law, that has allowed the game to come together and divide wealth more equally than in other places. But you know, if you take Anglo-Saxon countries, if you take Western European countries all together, and you add Japan and you add Singapore, you still don't get to 10% of the world's population. So in the other 90%, you've got the former Soviet Union, you've got the third worlders like myself, who are in part westernized. We have eyeglasses, we know watches, clocks, we know stock markets, but there's 1 billion of us. That leaves about 5.3 billion that are outside the system. And the question is, why are they outside the system? And that's one of the things, you know, that we have been looking at. And I think that we're outside the system for things that actually Marx organized or thought about better than we did. What Karl Marx said in the 19th century is that this was a system that was so sophisticated, so full of contradictions that it wouldn't survive. And it wouldn't survive precisely because it left too many people behind. And his analysis, which was good to that point, was that it left people behind because there would always be a concentration of power by a few that would take it from the rest. I think that's where he failed, because everywhere in the world, whether it's a political system, whatever it is, there's going to be concentration. Human beings tend to concentrate, and success depends on how you deconcentrate, and that's what I want to get to right now. What is it that we haven't been able to do in 90% of the world that the West has been able to do in 10% of the world? And I think it has to do with what Marx also called access to capital. He said that capital was crucial. I mean, in any part of the world, the word capital is the essence. Capital punishment, the capital issue, the capital point is the center point. And so what he said is capital. And by capital, he meant quite clearly not money, but he meant the capacity of generating what he called surplus value. And what he said was that surplus value was something that additional value came from the hide of workers who were exploited. Well, now we've got all these people in information technology with hardly any labor involved of a big sort, and wealth keeps on going on. So what one has to ask oneself is, where does this surplus come from? And that surplus, how does it get converted into capital? And so what we find is that the first thing that is important is, if I asked anybody in the room where they hold their capital, which is what gives them the capacity to invest and to control, they will always bring out a piece of paper. They will always bring out a blip on a screen that says that they control it. In other words, capital can only be captured in the head and with symbols. Capital, capita, comes from the idea head. It can only be captured, and you can only concretize it if you put it on that piece of paper. And that piece of paper, wherever you are, is a piece of paper that says that you are entitled to hold that capital. It means it's a property document. And 5,200,000,000 people in the world, that is to say 70% of the world's population, don't own anything that they control through paper and through the rule of law. And that is the basic problem. These are people that cannot defend what they have got. And so the answer to your question, I have a cultural problem, Your Holiness, which is I am Latin American, and culturally I tend to go on and on. So I want
we understand that problem in India well.
Very good. So I'll take just a minute to put it here. The greatness of capital we have seen, because we've seen all its problems, enormous concentration in the course of the last years. It's enormous. The thing about property is not so much the fact that it's a thing, but it's something that represents things that are brought together. The best example of that is when Wittgenstein, what magazines called the world's most outstanding philosopher in the 20th century, was asked what the universe was composed of. He said, of things in relationship to each other. That was it, one sentence. Things in relationship to each other. And the whole 19th century, when capitalism became strong, was essentially, in every discipline, how do things come together? In biology, it was DNA, something that isn't solid yet brings things together. It was called the binding problem. And capital is the binding problem, if you want to, of capitalism. It is how to bring things together. There isn't one thing in this room that hasn't been made by one man. And that's the fantastic thing about capitalism. It's made by many people. It forces you to cooperate. There isn't one thing that has been made by one person. And that's why when a great president of the United States was asked at a certain moment, what do you do in your family? He said, of the Jeffersons, I take the pride of being the nail maker. I'm the guy who brings things together. And so to me, that thing that brings things together is property rights and contracts, and 5.3 billion people in the world don't have them, and until they do, we're going to be in this mess and in these contradictions.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to take that to Vishnu, because to take from this broad overview to the kind of work you do, for example, in affordable housing in Ahmedabad. In India, you've got a country that's really still in transition. Economic reforms began 25 years ago, 1991. India's made a lot of progress. After China, it's pulled more people out of poverty than any other country, largely through the power of free enterprise. Could you sort of reflect upon some of the work you do with affordable housing and how you find free enterprise being able to help poor people in ways that traditionally the state was expected to do but has failed to do in India.
Sure. Before I get on to your question, I just want to set the context. Yesterday, Arthur started us by saying that free enterprise has pulled a lot of people out of poverty. My opinion is maybe we don't celebrate yet. The reason why we should not celebrate that yet is because, on the other hand, we see wealth actually becoming controlled by fewer number of people. Just 3 years ago, Forbes released a list of 235 people controlling the wealth of 3.5 billion people in the world. And this was just a few years ago. This year, they released a list where the number has shrunk to 85 people. So now 85 people in the world control the wealth of 3.5 billion people. So even though we are seeing pulling people out of poverty as a good indicator, on the other hand, we are seeing a lot of wealth being accumulated in fewer hands. Now, why is this a problem, and how can we start thinking differently about free enterprise is, earlier, I think a lot of times we saw philanthropy as something, I am capable, I am going to garner all the wealth, and then decide to give it away. And I think Shiv also alluded to this point yesterday by saying we have to see ourselves as custodians of wealth. But I think where we have to move now towards is how do we co-create wealth? How do we create wealth together with the people, right? So on the other hand, this also the other statistic which says 80% of the population, going back to Hernando's point, about 5.5 billion or more than that number of people in this world earn less than $10 a day, right? Now, if you look at that population and saying, how do I actually co-create wealth with them? How do I make sure that now I'm going to build wealth alongside with them? So that was the point which I wanted to start by making. And other context when we started working in India is that we worked in affordable housing, which is a huge problem all of us know. And when we started looking at the problem, we realized that 97% of Indians do not pay income tax. They all pay different kinds of taxes, but people don't pay income tax. 97% of Indians living in the cities. That means it leaves 3% of Indians actually who pay income tax. And because they pay income tax, they are eligible for a mortgage. They can buy something. They can prove that they own some property. Now, 97% of the people cannot own a property because they cannot get a mortgage. So we said, where is the problem? So how do we start looking at this? Then we realized that Hernando's point about the system, they are not part of the system because they cannot prove their income. 97% of the people could not prove their income. You take all the people surrounding in the cities today, the auto rickshaw drivers, the cab drivers, the vegetable vendors, the people who clean our homes, all of them have no way to prove their income. They all make money. They all take cash, but there's no way to prove their income. And because they were not able to prove, the financial institutions would not give them a mortgage. So then we said, how do we sort it out is by bringing these groups of people who cannot prove their income to people who can actually build homes, are the real estate developers. So we aggregated this demand and we brought them to the people who can actually build their homes. And then the last piece was, how do you get mortgage? Now, one of the key things which we realized in this whole ecosystem, and yesterday we started talking about community, and what I thought we missed yesterday, and today I want to make the point, is the role of women. If we really have to build a community and make sure that we can bring them to the system, we have to work with the women. Because women ensure that the monthly payments happen in time because they don't want to let the house go off. And they are the ones who really, truly care about their children's lives. And how do you actually bring the women as the center point of building community? I think that's really, really critical and what we realized yesterday. And the other point about building this community is to look at aspiration. We cannot ignore that poor people have very high aspirations. Just to give you one simple example, when we build these small homes of 200 square feet, why do they want refrigerators? They don't own a refrigerator, and the developers felt we don't need to give a space for a refrigerator. It's going to take up some space. 99% of the women said, if there is no space for a refrigerator, we wouldn't buy a home. So it's very important to understand the aspiration of poor people and to take care of the aspirations. So, and having women and their aspirations is very, very key to building a free enterprise.
Thank you. Shiv, you're someone your career has been as a businessman, and you've operated in some very tough markets and been remarkably successful. Yet you find yourself spending more and more time on non-business activities. Give me your sense of how is free enterprise working, and why do you seem to find that for you personally it's not enough?
Thank you. If you look at 1900, 1.7 billion people on the planet. Today, 7.3 billion people on the planet. By 2050, 9.5 billion people on the planet. So within 150 years, we would go from 1.7 to 9.5 billion people on the planet. And the Industrial Revolution, free markets, have created undoubtedly, undeniably huge wealth on the planet, pulled more people out of poverty than any other system in history, and clearly are the economic winners of any model that has been tried so far. But to follow in what Henanda was saying and what Vishnu was saying, that's great for the people that have benefited, the 2 billion, but what about the 5.3? So if you look at this room today, and just to one more time talk about inequity, assuming there are 100 people in this room, one person in this room goes to the end there and all the food and tea says, I want 43% of it. That one person would have 43% of all the food and water in this room. Then a few more people get up and say, no, no, no. 8%, 8 people in this room of 100 go and take 83% of the food and water in this room. Those are the statistics of how wealth is shared on this planet. The World Economic Forum, where I've been going for a long time, which represents in a way the 1% of the planet, came out with these statistics that 8.3% of the planet's population shares 83% of the planet's wealth.
But let me push back on that though, because wealth it's not fixed. There are a fixed number of teacups over there, but what's happening here is that the pie is growing bigger and bigger.
But we're taking a snapshot. We're taking a snapshot at this moment. The pie is growing. I buy into those arguments that we could have 1,000 teacups and free enterprise should create 1,000 teacups. I agree with all of that. But just taking a snapshot of what the situation is today, that is the reality. And I'm not saying that World Economic Forum, I presume, represents reasonably intellectual people that have come up with those numbers. The question is, I believe that we're sitting on a burning platform. Lord Buddha said that each human life is precious and each one of us is sitting on a burning platform because we are going to face death around us, we're going to face old age, sickness, and so on. But when we look at the world as a whole, I think we're sitting on a burning platform because the benefits of this tremendous wealth creation have not been shared broadly by the planet. And so I decided to spend my life, having spent most of it in free enterprise, creating wealth, and giving a lot of it away in different ways, realizing that's not enough. That actually we need to dedicate our lives as human beings to try and figure out how are we going to correct this model at scale. Because the problem is the scale impact. India, we add 25 million people a year, every year, to the population. If we aren't able to correct this, to figure out a model that works, to actually create enough wealth throughout the system, a better sharing of that wealth, I think we're in for serious problems ahead. I feel a bit like we're sitting on the Titanic in the captain's cabin, enjoying our music, enjoying our food, enjoying everything, but the ship is heading towards an iceberg. What are we going to do about it?
Let me bring Arthur in for a minute. Arthur, in your opinion, are we on the Titanic?
We don't know. We don't know if we're on the Titanic or on some ship that's actually seaworthy for a long time. But I will say that this is, we do know the best way to share the wealth. The best way to share the wealth is not to increase the equality of income, but to increase the equality of opportunity. That's the best way to share the wealth. The best way to share the wealth is not to bring wealth down out of the top, but to bring wealth up from the bottom. And furthermore, this wealth should be shared through opportunity where people can earn what they have. The most unstable sharing of wealth in the world is one in which the poor are dependent on the philanthropy of the rich. This is the point that Shiv just made. The greatest philanthropists in the world have learned, just very recently, over the past 10 years, that the earliest kinds of philanthropy that are dedicated to charity for others, these are necessary so that we can get into heaven. But they're not sustainable for actually creating a world in which there's true equality for others. So I think that the challenge that we have, such that this is not the Titanic, is that in which each one of us is dedicated in our own lives, because we are the 1%. Each one of us is dedicated in our lives to generating greater wealth among the poor, where people can earn their own success. What am I doing so that a poor man today is not dependent on me and not dependent on a government, but rather a poor man today is dependent on his own work and has the opportunity to lift himself up? That, in my view, is truly humanistic, because it's treating every poor person with the same dignity that I have in my life. And that is to say that it's not that I'm helping the poor, but that I am the poor and the poor man is me. That's true equality, in my view.
Question for Gurcharan. Now, the debate on inequality in India has sort of traditionally been quite different from the debate about inequality in the West, particularly since liberalization. Over here, the focus, at least among most economic thinkers, has been that there is a vast amount of absolute poverty. Hundreds of millions of people living lives where they're not able to live up to their potential. And what the reform program has been about really has been about lifting as many of these people as quickly as possible, even if that means some people, such as Shiv, get richer faster.
Right.
And that's a trade-off that many Indians have been very comfortable with.
Yes.
Do you think that has been the right way of looking at it?
Well, I think you're right. My driver really doesn't think the way these two gentlemen were just talking. He doesn't think about the very rich owning, controlling so much of the world. He has no problem with Mukesh Ambani getting filthy rich. He is concerned about himself and the opportunities that he has, and therefore he's concerned about a good school for his daughter. And that's the opportunity that his daughter will have. So I think the discourse in India after 91 changed and is changing in this direction, where we are concerned with lifting people out of poverty and not worry about inequality. As long as people are rising, and very clearly, if you see the data, 1% of the poor were crossing the poverty line. This is the standard old $1.25 a day poverty line of the World Bank. 1% have been rising for the last 25 years. And in the last 10 years, in the 10 years from 2002 to 2012, this was almost 2% per year. And this was the point that Tendulkar, the great economist on poverty, made, that we have lifted in India something like 350 million people above the poverty line. Now, this is not as much as China. China has lifted almost 500 million people above the poverty. But still, it's a significant achievement. And what my driver is reflecting is a discourse that's totally opposed to what these two gentlemen were talking about. He is not concerned about equality. He's concerned about opportunity, and he's concerned about rising up. And if there are rich people, he has no problem. He doesn't suffer from that kind of envy that somehow a lot of people do who become intellectuals and so on.
Let me bring it back to Shiv for a second. So you sort of, there are two sides to this debate. What makes you believe, apart from the numbers and what sort of people talk about at Davos, what in your day-to-day life makes you believe that what many people view as a great, very hopeful moment for India, particularly since the election last year of the Prime Minister, and our country broadly moving in the right direction still has a lot of problems, is moving in the right direction faster than at any time since independence. What makes you less than hopeful about that, or am I?
I'd first like to address what Gurucharan said,
Yeah.
because I don't want to convey in any sense that I'm talking about envy. And I'm not talking about equality by bringing all that wealth down and sharing it with everyone. That is the furthest thing from my mind. I'm talking about equality of opportunity. I'm talking about the ability to create wealth from the bottom up. I share in those views deeply, because I see the possibility of that being a wonderful thing. However, I do believe that the system is rigged and isn't functioning well to be able to really do that. And that's the problem. I think that start with education, right? I mean, if you aren't educating people at the bottom of the pyramid, if you aren't giving them a chance to learn literacy, STEM, and I believe values, if you aren't giving them those basics, how do you expect them to have equality of opportunity? And I think our system is failing miserably in that. I'm part of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on Education. And the Sustainable Development Goals, access has been created, still 58 million kids out of school in primary level. But I believe the question is the quality of education that we're talking about. Quality isn't there, and I believe that the underlying morality of that education system is what's missing. And so education without morality, to me, is hollow. And we need that moral education starting at the bottom of the pyramid. Martin Luther King Jr. said, each one of us has the choice whether to walk in creative altruism or in the light or in the darkness of destructive selfishness. That's a very deep comment, that the free market, the free enterprise system allows you to choose those two paths. You can walk in creative altruism or in destructive selfishness, but the education system needs to be able to create that ethos for discussing those things and allowing you to think about those things.
Fernando, what's your response to this ongoing and very interesting debate?
Well, I find it extremely interesting. I'm glad you left me out of these two gentlemen. But the whole idea of the capitalist system is interdependence. I mean, we stopped being interdependent somewhere in the 19th century. Anybody who did not cooperate with someone else did not create value added. That's the way it's going. Those who dominate the world are basically those who have learned to take and add up from different parts what is necessary. And I've always been fascinated about this issue of inequality, because one should aspire to more. I agree completely with what you've said about what everybody's been saying about opportunity. But what we have found out, not as a result of thinking that human nature goes one way or another, but as the way people behave, that there's a point of inequality where people start getting angry. Now, you can see that in the United States. I mean, the United States was known for a while for its presidents who said, "Bring down that wall, Mr. Gorbachev," right? And now there's a candidate to presidency of the United States who wants to bring up a wall. Okay. In India, you have got a Naxalite army. You've heard of the Naxalite army. All right. They're 200,000 strong. And they've got 40,000 AK-47s. And of these 40,000 AK-47s, they read Maoism. And they read Peruvian Shining Path. And we found them in Nigeria, and we find them among ISIS, and we found them in Libya. In other words, when inequality all of a sudden comes up, it comes up very, very suddenly. And I'm always surprised, of course, at the religiousness, the spiritual quality of the Indian people who happen to have controlled, in the best sense of the word, internal control, this continual tug that the rest of the world has between growth and inequality. You can see it even in Europe. I mean, the governments that are winning elections are on the left. They have big inequality warners. And those that are on the right, like Cameron's government, has tended to the left. So I think it's just a matter of time where that iceberg is going to come along the right, because it's part of human nature. Now, that doesn't mean we all go at the same rate. We advance at the same speed. But the fact is, and it is one of capitalism's problems, it is that there is a reply to why some people are doing better than others. And I repeat, Capitalism is the result of joining things together. And if you do not have access to contracts, and if you do not have access to property rights, I mean, you have things but no property rights that are legal on them. If you cannot use your property to generate shares so that you can raise capital, or use it as a guarantee, which what you're doing, to be able to get credit, things don't happen. Let me give you a very simple idea that I got in India. I was invited by these people, these ladies, which you were talking very much about, women, which you were very much talking about, SEWA, Self-Employed Women's Association. Now, I was invited, I didn't want to go, but my Indian hosts insisted that I go. And I said, I really know very little about women, and what little I know about them, I've always gotten into trouble. But let me sit down and listen. So I listened. And there were 32 vice presidents of all these regions in India. Beautiful. Everybody had rings on their toes, on their hands, and they talked, and there was translation. But everybody complained about land or homes. Now I said, wait a second. This is artisanry. This is industry. What are they doing complaining about land? And then it occurred to me that I might have something to say based on Latin American experience. And I asked, how many of you are married? Now, these are all women about over 40, 50. I said, how many of you are married? Not the symbolic stuff, which is fine. How many of you are married by law? There wasn't one hand that was raised. And then I asked the second question, which is a very Latin American question. Could that explain, to a certain degree, why you have no access to land? And with the land, you have no access to location, nor to an address. And I don't know the Indian way of doing things, but everybody said something like, hululululululu. And I said, all right, that's one thing. So what you've gotten is a westernized version of capitalism. You see, capitalism assumes that we're all Americans, that we all get married. And if we don't get married, we have palimony contracts and palimony laws. You got nothing. And so when your husband dies or goes away, you got nothing. Secondly, what do you have? Why do you protect your home so much? Where do you work from? What factory do you work at? Nobody worked at a factory. Everybody worked at a home. So it was the United States, 18th, 19th century, where we worked in cottage industries. So when the government goes and eminent domain takes away your home because they're going to build a road, they're going to put a hospital, they compensate you for your house. Do they compensate you for your industry? A lady had a kite factory, and she said, I'm located here because the bamboo's cheap, and also because kites are good for sale. When they put me 20 kilometers away, it isn't there. So here's the issue. The problem, I think, in terms of us who are third worlders, is that we are tinned products of American capitalism. We haven't done enough, which is what you're trying to do the way I see it, to try and interpret what it means in our reality without those common law judges, without all the great things that these Americans did in the 19th century, which we haven't done. And with whether we like it or not, common law or not, we are basically statutory law people, and we have to be more inventive. Otherwise, unless India is really made of very, very special people, you are going to get violence. It's unavoidable.
Let me take this to Jay. I mean, it's actually, India actually does, legal system is based on common law thanks to the British colonial tradition. But let me take this to Jay. If you were to sort of, imagine for a moment that this conversation was not happening over here, but was happening in your constituency, Kendrapara, in the eastern part of India, how do you think your constituents would be reacting to this debate that we've been seeing?
So I stand somewhere in between Gurcharan and the other point of view. Generally, I agree with Gurcharan that resentment or envy is not what is bothering most of my constituents. They're bothered about jobs. They're bothered about having access to medical treatment, education, property. Most of them have issues that because they're poor, they don't have titles. These are true. But it is also true, as Hernando said, that a point comes when the rigging of the system that Shiv talked about is so egregious that it creates tremendous anger. We saw that in last year's election in India because, and let me put a context to this. We had sort of a mixed but heavily socialist-dominated economy for many decades, because at independence, our idea of international trade and capitalism was the East India Company. and despite the fact that Gandhiji actually took a lot of help from Indian capitalists, our first decades of governance were years in which people like Rajgopalachari and Minu Masani got outmaneuvered. In 1991, we turned it around, and over 20 years, we've seen a tremendous growth of India, growth of confidence, getting away of the diffidence of the earlier decades. But in the last decade, that narrative got mixed up because the political results were being misinterpreted by those who were in government, and we sort of took the wagon off the rails again. What you saw in last year's election was this resentment of quite a lot of people. A lot of the seats that Mr. Modi's party has got in parliament were not pro-Modi, but anti-Congress. And the reason for that was they saw the egregious scandals and the scams, the crony capitalism, and in the meantime, they were facing very high inflation, and job growth was poor. And that's when that resentment kicked in. And of course, not to take away from Mr. Modi's campaign of development, which in modern times was the very first national campaign based on development, rather than on inflation or terrorist threat or some other issue. We've had this at regional levels. We've had this in Odisha, in Bihar, in Gujarat, where the past has been done away with, and the narrative of governance, good governance, better economics, growth, jobs, etc., has won elections. Now, and it won a national election last year. Now, there is gradual improvement, which you alluded to, but I think we need much faster improvement, much faster creation of jobs, much faster leveling of the playing field. Yesterday, we talked about access to education. Otherwise, the resentment will overtake the self-interest of the bottom billion.
Kushan, very quickly.
Very quickly, I don't think there's as much a divide between where I stand and where this debate on that side was taking place, because I think now we should perhaps turn to answers and not a diagnosis. And the reality is that opportunity, which is the word we have been using, that opportunity comes from good education, opportunity comes from titles to property, opportunity comes from good, affordable health care. Now, what I want to ask really is a question to Hernando. I want to know, why is it that the titling project, which you actually was an inspiration for states like Andhra and Karnataka in India, he was an inspiration to these states, putting online the titles of all the people, the poor and the rich, online. Why has this not broadly covered the country right away? Because it was such a good idea. Similarly, you could explain about affordable housing or education.
Stick one question to Hernando.
Sure. Thank you for your question. I don't have the inside story. I have an educated guess. You are a country, as you mentioned before, that does have, given the British heritage, common law. But the question is, how strong is your common law? And the fact is that your country, I think, is mainly run on statutory law. Because if you have a scam or the kind of things you talked about, an inside job that privileges somebody, it's not the United States that you go and do it through a court. You do it through political connections. So your common law is in the Constitution, but it's not in the works the way it would be in developed countries. That is the first thing. The second thing is, everything we have is on the surface of the earth. We don't live on balloons, et cetera. So whoever controls the earth has got all things in their hands, from the ecology to the creating of wealth, to the resources, to the homes, or whatever it is. And what we had basically proposed when asked by the Indian government what they should do is, first of all, create a system that is based on local practices, what I would consider the common law, that sense, in the customary law. How is it really divided up? Because if you look at Indian law, which is no different from anything I've seen every part of the world, and you start saying, how am I going to solve this problem in Delhi or in Bengal or wherever it is, and you go to a lawyer's office, it's always one piece of paper over another. We wish we could actually solve it, but you see, this right impinges upon this right, and this is really a result of a divorce that took place and a tribe, etc. And you can't sort it out. So what we told them that I think they had to do was, if you go to the ground, which is what the Americans did very early on in the 19th century, there is no rugs. There are no rugs. There is no rug on top of it. There's a line, which means it's already been sorted out, and there's a consensus behind. And what you got to discover is those consensuses. We also told the Indian government that when you do that, you're going to destroy the livelihood of a whole bunch of technocrats, both public and private, who have been saying that it's too complicated to be solved in any other way. And that the way that the Americans, whether they know it or not, they remember it or not, they have a tendency to forget their 18th and 19th century, except for their good parts. They destroyed British law. They destroyed heredity the way it was, and they said, who's got control where? And where is the consensus? Because property is only consensus. Now, when it got to that level, that's when you find out whether the people you're talking have got leadership or they don't. Because at the end, there is no system aside from someone coming in and saying, there is an agreement. Just one last question. You know, I used to, when I was a child, I was fascinated by India because I used to see some films with a fantastic movie actor called Sabu. Sabu, you remember Sabu? Well, Sabu used to run along the jungle and in community land, and all of a sudden he'd stop somewhere because there's an arrow. Whap! That went right against the tree. He said, that's where property stops and that's where it ends. So you got to find out where the arrows are. Once you get the arrows, you've got the Indian consensus, then you can legislate.
Excellent. I think we'd love to open it up now to Your Holiness and have you react to what you've been listening to.
I'm going to repeat. You start. I don't know. You mentioned at the beginning. I mean, you express, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think human problem which we are facing, I think so complicated. And also, you see, all these things, you see, the environment. And all these, I think not only we human beings own choice, but also you see depend on the circumstances. So all these things, I think, you know, Buddhists call Paticca everything interrelated. I think successful of American capitalism, because I think World War also makes, I think, some contribution. A lot of factory produce a lot of weapon. So weapons, you see, always what call? Oh, so use weapon, then more opportunities selling. There is no kind of recycle or something, isn't it? So I think everything you see interrelated. Now the capitalism or socialism, I prefer socialism. The very idea, capitalism, just thinking profit, how to make money. The socialism more concerned about the society. So my attraction about Marxist economy is Karl Marx emphasis equal distribution. That I very much admire. That's very good. So I think at that time, too much exploitation, the workers. So you see, he special emphasis, equal distribution, and express concern about working class people. But the reality, now I think today, American capitalism seems to see more human face rather than the socialism. former Soviet Union. I think terrible. And now people's problem to China. Or socialism. But actually worst kind of capitalism. So all these system, no matter how beautiful the system, but ultimately depend on individual. Look now, religion, all major religious tradition talks love, compassion, forgiveness, tolerance. But the individual person is sometimes utilize the very religion, so the very thing which teach us compassion, forgiveness, tolerance, that utilize for further sort of division, hatred, suspicion, like that. So as you mentioned, and also yesterday, ultimately, individuals' way of thinking and utilize our education, our knowledge, our intelligence properly, combined with a moral principle. Compassion is the basis of moral principle. The morality or a good thing, there's no absolute. This depends on the circumstances. And ultimately, sense of concern of others' well-being, respect others' life, their right. That is moral principle, basis of moral principle. So irrespective whether religious believer or non-believer, we are a social animal. Individual's future depends on the rest of them. So understanding that, then take care about others' well-being. That kind of sort of moral principle through education, from kindergarten up to university level. So then, as I mentioned yesterday, within this century, there is possibility to develop a more harmonious world on the basis of sort of friendship, trust, and compassion. So of course, other complicated thing, I don't know. So those experts, let them sort of discuss and solve.
Your Holiness,
I don't think, you see, nobody can solve these problems, you see. I think very ultimate, unless you see some change here, then even religion failed to solve this problem.
Your Holiness, you've been in India for 56 years, you said. Do you think that over that period things have gotten better for most people?
I think better. Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, yesterday, I think India, comparatively, much more stable, peaceful. And firstly, religious sort of community, I think very good, harmonious spirit there. And then 1,000-year-old, you have the concept of ahimsa. So ahimsa, I think people usually, I think still, I feel not adequate explanation about real sort of fact, real sort of the important thing of ahimsa. Ahimsa, just simply not harming other. That's not ahimsa. You have the opportunity to bully, to harm, but deliberately restrain these things out of respect their right or their well-being. That's ahimsa. So ahimsa is action. That kind of action, genuine action, you see, come only through karuna, respect other, sense of concern of others' well-being. So India, I think really, now since I'm longest guest of Indian government, so I have to say something good for India. I usually, you see, describe myself as a messenger of ancient Indian thought. Ahimsa. Wonderful. And secular. India's concept, secular, as I mentioned yesterday, not only respect all religion, but also respect a non-believer. So that is something very relevant in today's world. So these things, so I always half teasing, you see, Ancient Indians were our guru. Modern Indian, too much westernized, so no longer our guru. So ultimately, I believe, motivation. That's the key thing. Even military, as a warfare, with sense of respect others' life, sense of concern of others' well-being, destruction will be limited. Warfare, full, even I think nice work, out of hatred, out of jealousy, no matter what the right matter, but can be easily, go wrong. So democracy, all this socialism, actually idea, I think socialism idea is very good. But then people who carry that, too much selfish, never concerned about other. Then other facility, no proper rule of law, no free speech, correct? No freedom of speech, and particularly media. I think India, media, quite free. That's very good. So even something small happen, especially politicians, you see something happen, the media always report that. So that, you see, China lacking that. So I always see expressing when I meet some Chinese, you need freedom of media, freedom of information, because 1.3 billion Chinese people have a right to know the reality. Once they know the reality, they also have the ability to judge what is right, what is wrong. So therefore, the censorship is immoral. So India, of course, very free, very good. Then within that some kind of atmosphere, the rule of law also, in spite some sort of drawbacks, but basically very good. And India's democracy, I think wonderful, like that. But that does not mean it's just something 100% sort of correct. We need a lot of work. I think time always moving. We never content, my position or my sort of situation is something good and contented. No further develop. That's totally wrong. Time always change. With changing of time, the reality also changing. So we have to think fresh ideas, more effort. That's my view. I think sometimes Indians, we contented 1,000-year-old our culture, still carry that. I think now we have to think seriously. If we want to be realistic, then we have to act according to the new reality. That's my view.
Thank you. We have a few minutes more, so I'm going to ask a couple of quick questions. Robert, let me turn to you. This idea of socialism is sort of still a live debate in many ways in India. Is socialism a great idea that was just not implemented properly by people with bad motivation? Or is socialism not such a good idea?
The answer is no, it was not a great idea that was not implemented well. This is not working here.
I think,
I think that the Dalai Lama, His Holiness...
Sorry, I want to add one thing. When the Soviet Union collapsed, then all Eastern European countries, former communist countries, also then it's changed. So then Czechoslovakia Republic, the President Havel, invited me. Soon after, there are a new situation. So then, at that time, I expressed, now there's the Soviet style of socialism failed. Even economic field also stagnation. So failed. The Western capitalist, pure capitalism, not much of a moral principle. So now time come, you have the opportunity to try to find some kind of synthesized sort of new thinking. So this is a good opportunity, I express, but nothing happened. So I think they also, I think, feel, I don't know. Maybe that.
His Holiness, I think, really hit it on the mark when he talked about the individual, the person. And the basis of free market capitalism is freedom
That's right.
for the individual.
That's right.
And just as we said yesterday about helping the poor, we had to begin with recognizing them as assets. In economic systems, we begin by recognizing everyone as assets who, if we allow them the greatest amount of freedom, they will help the most amount of people. That's what we believe. And
And give opportunity
To
or
all-
freedom, the individual creativity nature. That's very, very important.
And in contrast, this obsession on collectivism tends to undermine that freedom and ends up not really giving people the opportunity
That's
to
right.
move up the way that they best would thrive.
Absolutely right. Right.
Please go ahead.
I think 10 now. T.
One last comment.
Robert, I think that the behavior you're describing, wherein those who are in the position to create great wealth will bring about possibility for those who are beneath them in the system, really only takes place when there is a mindset of abundance, where there is a mindset of there being enough and plenty. When fear enters in and a ideology of scarcity enters in, that stops, it halts and hesitates. So I think the key word of the conference, abundance, it has to be understood, it has to be part of education, when we're talking about educating values, that we're operating from plenty. We really, really are. So that's key. And the other thing that I really would like to revisit, which is a question Danny asked at the end of the morning yesterday, is I wanted to just discuss a little bit the English derivation of the word compassion, which has within it the first part, come, meaning with, and that is the coming together that Gerondo was speaking about, the with, and the passion, which is really related to the word suffering. And suffering is a word that it comes, I believe, from the Greek, and it has to do with not so much pain, but carrying a burden. And it's related to a word that is most similar to undercarriage, or something that lifts. So when we have compassion, it is not pity. Pity is not the meaning of the word at all. Pity implies a differential. A differential does not imply being with. And it's very important that we understand that compassion is not pity. It is working with others to lift, to uplift. And that does not mean to lift for. It does not mean to lift for. It means to lift with, to do what we can do from where we are, to help them do what they can do from where they are. And so compassion, abundance, lifting up with, together, coming together. And that is why we're here on this planet at this time.
Thank you. Well, I think we have just 5 minutes. Arthur, why don't, if you have any final comments to sum up, and then we'll break it for tea.
Well, where we are in the discussion is a nice turning point to the next panel. What we've been discussing is the power of free enterprise, and I think that ultimately the conclusion that we've arrived is that the power of free enterprise is not to make the rich richer. It can do that, but that's not good free enterprise. That's not good capitalism. That's our worst impulses, where we accumulate resources for those who are already rich. On the contrary, good capitalism, which is to say the true moral power of free enterprise, is to push opportunity all the way down to the bottom, and no other system in human history has been able to do that, and we know that because of the numbers of people who've been pulled out of poverty. So the answer that we have to ask next is, what motivates a good use of markets? What motivates the moral power of free enterprise? And the answer to that is the first word, which is morals. That's the first thing that we need to talk about, and that Robert Doerr is going to host this next session. So what, as we have in our minds as we enjoy our tea and our cookies, because that will motivate us to get into a good moral mindset, I think, is what are the morals that we need such that capitalism can be good in the service of humanity? What are the morals we need to avoid such that capitalism actually doesn't simply lead to greater accumulation and greater inequality in our world? T?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.